US President Joe Biden declared that democracy is on the ballot at the US election in November. And when Australians go to the polls next year, there will be our trademark democracy sausage, as well as growing tide of confusion and information and downright lies peddled on social media. So are we facing a crisis of democracy? David Runciman is here for that conversation. He's a former Cambridge Don turned podcaster who warns of rising populism and the undermining of institutions. Roxane Gay is an American writer and commentator who says Kamala Harris's candidacy has given her licence to re-engage and dream about the future. George Brandis is an academic at the ANU. Prior to that, he was the High Commissioner to the UK and Australia's Attorney General. Anne Ali is the Federal Minister for Youth and has a background running programs that counter violent extremism. And Keith Wallahan is a former barrister and Army veteran who is now the Liberal MP for Menzies in Victoria. Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Patricia Carvelis. I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we're broadcasting from tonight here in Sydney. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Quandra is the hashtag. Please get involved. To get us started tonight, here's a question from Oliver Wilde. Hi, Oliver.
Hi, Patricia. I'm 16 years old. I can pay tax, I can work full-time, I can enlist in the army, I can drive a car, and can be held criminally responsible for a crime. But I can't vote. If politicians are wondering why democracy is in a crisis and political disillusionment is at an all-time high, it's because globally, people don't feel represented. Is making the voting age 16 the pathway forward to strengthening our democracy?
David Runciman.
I agree, but I think it should be lower. I would take it all the way down to 6. And I would let kids vote. And for all those reasons that we just heard, we load kids with responsibility, criminal responsibility. We teach them civics. We tell them to be good citizens. We ask a lot of them, and yet we don't give them the basic democratic right. And the other thing to remember is that we don't have a cutoff at the other end of the scale, of the age scale. So we are rapidly aging societies. There are more and more older voters. And we know, older people lose cognitive function. It's just a fact of life. We don't take votes away from people as they get older. We should give votes to people as they're gaining education and cognitive function. I think the more people are involved in democracy from 6 to 106, the better it would be. It wouldn't be dangerous. It would be exciting. And I don't think you can exclude kids any longer from this conversation. I think kids need to be part of it.
And I've got to say, you're in your hotel room because you're unwell at the moment and you won't be with us for the whole hour, but we appreciate you joining. I want to go back to you, Oliver. 6, does that sound a bit young to you? You were going for 16, but 6?
Well, obviously, I think, if you're going to go down to 6, I don't believe it should be 6, but I can see the reasons why David is talking about wanting to make it 6, because I just feel as if, the criminal age for responsibility is 10, and all the other reasons I just outlined are 16. So when we look at that, I feel like 16 is a good age where you're realising what's happening in the world and you understand the influence of your vote.
Dr Anne Ali, you are Minister for Youth. 6 might be a bit young and radical, but 16, is it?
I've actually spoken to a number of young people who do want the voting age lowered to 16, but I've also spoken to other young people who don't. So there's not consensus on the lowering of the age. I do try to encourage, though, young people that there are other ways to engage politically, and that voting, I don't think, is the only way of having a say in the things that matter to you. And that's what we've done with the Office for Youth in re-establishing the Office for Youth and through our engagement program, bringing young people in. What I found really interesting, though, is that when we put out the call for expressions of interest for our steering committee, we had 1,500 applications from young people right across Australia for a 15-person young steering committee, which demonstrates to me that young people do want to have a say and they do want to be engaged. Electoral reform is not in my portfolio. And there is a review at the moment about electoral reform where that might be considered. However, in the youth portfolio, we're out there talking to young people and trying to find other ways for them to engage and asking them how they want to engage as well. And with the survey that we did, a lot of young people, most of the young people that we spoke, they would like to engage with face-to-face meetings, on social media, at events and so on. And there's still a lot of, some want to lower the voting age and some don't.
Keith, that point, though, the criminal age of responsibility being 10, that is a pretty powerful point, right?
Well, can I just say, Oliver, here you are as a 16-year-old putting your case on live TV, so well done to you. One of the great honours I have as a member of the House of Representatives is visiting schools, or they come and visit us in Parliament. And there's usually two questions that get asked, especially primary schools. They say, what was it like working at McDonald's? Because their teachers tell them I worked there. And the other is...
So did Kamala Harris.
She did.
It's the thing
yes,
now.
It is a very, very important part of her background. But they also say, why are you doing this? And I think that's one of the most important questions that gets asked. And what I tell them is that there are 113,000 voters in my electorate, but there are 170,000 people. And my job, and the job of every member of the House of Representatives, is to represent everyone. And that includes a huge number of children. I think we have to draw a line in the sand at some number. I think 18 is about right. I would be worried that you would see political parties going into schools for tactical political reasons.
Would you be tempted to?
Well,
is that what you're saying?
Well, I think all political parties would, and I don't think that would be fair on schools or students. The time comes. There is a time, and 18 makes sense, and it's consistent with many democracies around the world.
David Runciman, these politicians can't even agree to 16. Is your the age of 6 idea never going to fly, given that response?
I mean, it's not going to fly for a while, but on that line that you shouldn't bring politics into schools, actually, I think if politics came into schools, it would be good for politics. People behave better around children. We take misinformation seriously in schools, and teachers are really good at protecting kids from misinformation. Everybody behaves better around teachers. I don't think it would corrupt the schools. I think it would improve the politics. And we've been hearing about all the ways that kids can get involved. We encourage them to take part, to campaign. We don't talk to adults like that and say, but by the way, you can't vote. You know, voting is part of that package. And I think one of the reasons that children feel a distance from politics is it's all coming one way. We want them to do things, but we don't give them the right to say who they want to speak for them, who they want to take decisions for them. They have decisions taken for them in their lives all the time. And I think a bit of democracy, real democracy for kids, would be really good.
Roxanne, do you think it should be lowered, the voting age? I mean, in the US, you've got problems even getting people to vote who are legally allowed to vote.
Yes. Yes, I think it should be lower. I think if you're going to let your children enter the army at 16, my goodness, how do you not let them have a say in what that army is going to go do? And it seems incredibly unfair. Actually, I would raise the age at which people can enter the army and raise the age at which people should have to pay taxes, and also still lower the voting age. 16, 14, I think children are incredibly smart and we take them for granted. And this is the world that we're leaving for them, so why shouldn't they have a say in it?
George Brandis, David Runciman's argument is that every time we make democracy better, we enfranchise a different group, and that young people are the last not to be enfranchised. Do you think they need more of a say in politics?
Well, I think there are two different issues here. The first is what David Runciman has put on the table is whether children should have the vote. The other issue, which Oliver has really identified, is really a different question, and that is where you draw the distinction between childhood and adulthood. Now, there'll always be a debate about where you draw that line, and it's drawn at different points for different purposes, for drinking, for driving a motor car, for getting a pilot's licence, which in some parts of Australia is a different age from getting a driver's licence, for purchasing tobacco products. and so forth. So I think there'll always be a debate around about when childhood finishes and adulthood and the responsibilities that go with it begins. I think that's quite a different question from the question of should children have a vote. Now, I think the idea of 6-year-olds having a vote is, with all due respect, ridiculous. I think the country is open for an argument about when we recognise an age at which we give people adult responsibilities, including the franchise. Now, many years ago, there was a debate in Australia about whether the voting age should be lowered from 21 to 18. And it was lowered to 18, the sky didn't fall in. I think we probably are going to have this debate about whether it should be 18 or 16.
So are you open-minded?
Well, I'm prepared to listen to the argument. It's been put on the table in the United Kingdom by the new government who are exploring the idea of lowering the voting age there to 16. So I think we are going to have this discussion in Australia in coming years, but that's quite a different discussion from the question of whether children should be voting.
Next, we're going to hear from Jenny Carroll. Hi, Jenny.
Hi. My children, now almost 30 and 34, went to the local state public school and were dictated to that multiculturalism is a great thing. I don't believe it is, as I feel that the culture of the original British/Irish majority has been demonised constantly for the last 3 decades. Case in point, frequent vandalism of memorials to Captain Cook. How does democracy fit into this atmosphere of beat up the white guy?
Anne Ali.
Thank you for your question. I do have to disagree with you. I think multiculturalism isn't a thing, it's what we are. It's the character of our nation. It's not a policy that was foisted on anyone. Take a look around you. We are multicultural. It is who we are. It is who we are, and I think it has brought immense benefits to this country. As somebody who migrated here myself, I think multiculturalism has brought immense benefits, and I'm not talking about being able to have some soy sauce on your sausage roll or being able to wear a sari or any of those things. I'm talking about democracy is more resilient and is better when there are diverse ideas, diverse thinking, of faiths, diversity of cultural backgrounds. Democracy is better for it. I don't think we bash the white guy, as you might say, and perhaps if we were to trade places for a day, you might think differently. Because I get quite a bit of racism, who would have thought? So I think if we were to trade places and if we had the opportunity to walk in each other's shoes, you might think differently.
George Brandis.
I'm somebody who, during my time in Parliament, was always a strong defender of multiculturalism in the Liberal Party. But I don't think it's an either-or question. I think we can accept that Australia is a multicultural society. I mean, it's not a question of whether we should be a multicultural society. We are. That is the reality, and that's not going to change. So we want to be the best multicultural society that we can be. But on the other hand, that doesn't, at least to my mind, involve disrespecting the British heritage, which was a very important framing set of values for modern Australia. When we think of our legal system, our parliamentary institutions, our system of government, our commercial practices, so many of the fundamental features of Australian society we owe to our British heritage. And rather than be ashamed of that, we should be proud of it. It infuriates me when people vandalise statues of Captain Cook. It angers me as much as I'm sure it angers you. But I think we can see the good in all the dimensions of Australian society throughout the course of its development to have reached the point we have now reached, where we're proud of our very, very ancient Indigenous heritage. We're proud of our more modern British institutions that go back to 1788, and we're proud of the society that has evolved from those institutions that both sides of politics, as a joint endeavour really, have created, which is, I think, one of the world's most successful multicultural society. So I don't think that the antithesis, I think, that is implicit in your question really exists.
Jenny, I'll go back to you then. I mean, there was different parts of your question too, right? And the toppling and the graffiti obviously has been a big issue. It's also happening internationally in other places. Is that migration that you think's responsible for that, or is it some, rejection of the colonial past?
I think it's not necessarily migration. It's that we haven't reconciled maybe to the Aborigines sufficiently, and I think that might be underlying a lot of it, that we can't really look at those types of heroes in our background and say thank you for what you did, because he was just doing a job, Captain James Cook. He was told to navigate and find the Great South Land. So if he is made to blame, I think that's so wrong.
David Runciman, obviously this is a debate that's been had worldwide in places that have been colonised, but there is a kind of rejection of it and there is a tension. How do you reflect on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting word in that question was majority. So it was a question about the demonisation of the white majority. So demonisation is never a good idea. Beating up on people is never a good idea. But we are talking about the majority here, and in democracies, if this is a question about democracy, the majority tends to get its way. Democracy is majority rule. That's how it works. And so I think the majority should expect some pushback, because it's pushback against the fact that it's much harder actually for minorities to assert themselves. Now, multiculturalism is a version of that, and these things can alienate people and antagonize people in lots of different ways. But there is a big difference, I think, in a democracy between pushback against the overwhelming majority, because they do have so many opportunities to assert and establish their point of view. And I think the majority should accept in a democracy the advantages lie with them. And that, some humility comes with that too.
Roxanne Kay?
Well, I think it's interesting because when you look at the history of this country, it's not that complicated. There were people that were the First Nations people, and then it was taken from them. And just because something is your job doesn't mean you should do it. You have the power to say, no, perhaps I won't steal this land. But history is what it is, and so we have to accept where we are. And so this is a multicultural society, which means that it's going to be an incorporation not only of British identity, but also First Nations identities, and of course, all of the many wonderful people that have emigrated to this country. And so it's always interesting when the majority feels that multiculturalism is being shoved down their throats, because what does that mean exactly? Like, having to learn about other cultures should be something that is enriching and dynamic, and in general it is. And so what is the thing that makes you feel oppressed by acknowledging that there are other cultures in the world and that we should create space for all of those voices to be heard? I think that we really have to rethink what oppression feels like, because when you have such a significant majority as people here do, I think it's better to ask how the First Nations people and immigrants to this country feel about all of the British norms that are foisted upon them.
Keith Wallahan, is there kind of a culture of beating up on the white guy, which is part of that question?
I don't think it is based on race, but I think often there is a tension between acknowledging and cherishing our multicultural background and this disdain for a healthy patriotism as opposed to nationalism. And by a healthy patriotism, we mean a love of this country that we all share. And that's a unifying moment. And it's also about gratitude for where we are. And for me, after visiting schools, citizenship ceremonies are one of the best parts of this job. And there you see people in their national dress from all around the world. And then they hold the Australian flag and they sing the national anthem with tears, many tears running down their face. And then when you see in the Defence Force people from all faith backgrounds, all cultural backgrounds, they have that one flag being Australian. So I think we need to find a way that it's not either or. We are a proud multicultural nation with a proud Indigenous heritage. But there is something that binds us all together as Australians, and that's never in conflict with being a multicultural nation.
We'll keep this discussion going with a question from Jessica Gray.
Hi. As a high school teacher, I've become increasingly concerned about the role of social media as the primary source of news and the subsequent spread of disinformation. Given the decline in traditional media and the rise of polarising and radical views, as we consistently see with Trumpist rhetoric, how can we rebuild confidence in democratic institutions among young people, and how big of a role should our government play in this?
David Runciman, I want to bring you in on that. More polarised views coming up in classrooms.
Yeah, and we were talking before about when kids should vote, but we're really cavalier about giving them phones. You know, we don't want to let them vote, but we're perfectly happy to let them have a smartphone. It seems to me that might be the wrong way round. But if the question is about what we can do about it for our democracies, I think the key here is the power of the technology companies. Again, there's often a premium on telling people to behave better, learn how to behave better online, you know, teach themselves how to, including kids, teach themselves how to find the right information. But the people who are really unregulated and out of control are the platforms, the companies. And there is too much self-regulation in that world. We don't let pharmaceutical companies self-regulate. We don't let alcohol companies self-regulate. But we do let these companies on the whole self-regulate, and we trust them too much to manage this space. I think politicians, I think elected governments, I think citizens should push much harder for control of that space, because we all find it really hard to manage it, not just kids. Everyone is a bit lost in the world of information that's out there, and we need more direct democratic input. These companies are not democratic themselves, right? They're run by people who have unbelievable power. You know, if you think about the way those companies are set up, they're nothing like the democracies that they inform and misinform. We need more democracy in the way that social media is managed by the people who own it and run it and control the platforms.
Jessica, I just want to get a better sense from you. What sort of conversations are happening in classrooms? What have you observed about more extreme views?
It's more the fact that, so I'll firstly say that the government's ban on phones in classrooms has been incredible. You know, students, of course, will still go into the bathroom and use them, but far less phones in the classroom. And I remain neutral. It's my job to remain neutral in the classroom. But what I do hear is these students just repeating that real extreme news. It's like they've constantly got access to that kind of news. And especially with the Democratic election over in America at the moment, that's on the rise again with the governor in North Carolina, for instance, anything that comes out of Trump's mouth, really. And that's what I'm hearing.
So are you hearing it on the left and the right?
More the right. Yes, definitely more the right.
And what are the demographics, like which are the kids repeating some of these lines? Do they believe it, or are they just...
I think what's really concerning is that it's young boys. It's probably the majority, 14, 15-year-old boys. They're the ones repeating this information.
Roxanne Gay, so that's in Australian classrooms, repeating Trump lines in Australian classrooms. You've come all this way.
I know, and you can't leave Trump. It's terrible, but it is alarming. And I think, as David says, it's, you know, we give children these phones and we don't get to control them. I mean, you can put all of the parental controls you want, but my nieces regularly dismantle them in front of me. And so they know more about these phones than we do. And because we don't ask the internet companies to self-regulate, we give them these gardens and then they decide to trash those gardens and pollute those gardens. It becomes a really untenable situation where there's all this misinformation. Part of the way we can start to combat this is, of course, through media literacy, but we can only do so much in the classroom. Teachers only have so many hours in a day and their curricula are already overloaded. So we have to demand that these internet companies start regulating hate on their platforms. It's not about silencing conservatism, but there's a difference between conservatism and bigotry. And a lot of what we see, particularly around Trump and the current iteration of the Republican Party in the United States, is just unchecked bigotry. And it is a dangerous thing. And also, I think getting phones out of classrooms is a huge step forward.
Thank you very much. And David Runciman, I want to thank you. I know that you're not feeling well, so we're going to let you go off and have a snooze and recover. Thank you so much for joining us on our panel. Please, everyone.
Thank you.
And he's been, of course, in Australia as part of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. He was unwell today, but he still joined us on the screen, which is amazing. Now I'd like to bring in Rohan Hora. Hi, Rohan.
Hi. Kamala Harris has just become the first Asian American and African American woman to lead a presidential ticket in US political history. And for me, as an Indian person, this is a massive milestone. What do you think is the significance of being able to see yourself in political leaders?
Roxanne.
Oh, I think it's incredible. Representation does matter because it shows young people what is possible for them. If you don't ever see anyone who looks like you or who has lived through similar experiences, achieving the kinds of things you might want for yourself, you don't even know what's possible. You know there's a ceiling above you, but you don't know how high up it is. And so I think it's incredible. And Kamala Harris may not be a perfect candidate, but she is a great candidate. And I'm really excited by what she has to offer. I hope in the next 2.5 months we start to see more of what her actual policies are, because that's what really matters. It's not her identity, it's what is she going to do, not only for the American people, but for people around the world. But I know that for South Asian people and for African American people, this is huge, and many of us did not think we would see this in our lifetime. And I can only hope that the United States does the right thing come November 4th.
Dr. Anne Ali, I want to bring you in because I imagine growing up you didn't really see yourself in...
Actually,
Were there any Australian politicians that you... No?
None, but actually it's really touching, Rohan, to hear you say how much of an impact it has on you, because I never imagined a career in politics for myself. And I have to say, it's not just politics, mainstream media as well. You know, there's very little diversity, and it's true that you can't be what you can't say. I feel really pleased that now I look at the parliament now and it's a lot more diverse than when I first entered the parliament. I think when I first entered, it was Linda Burney and I, and from the day we got elected, the two of us together, we have been mistaken for each other since that day, literally. Everyone thinks I'm her and she is me. We have a much more diverse parliament now, not just in terms of gender or like one dimension of diversity, but intersectionalities of diversity, of cultural background, ethnicity, of religious affiliation, a whole range of diversities too, which only makes our parliament better. But I think for me, it was very soon after I got elected, I did an interview on Arabic radio, and after hanging up after finishing the interviewer said to me, she said, you know, your being elected really makes a big difference. And I was just like, yeah, thanks. And she said, no, really, because I tell my daughter every day that she can be whatever she wants to be, but you've made it real. And I think that says it all.
Rohan, why does it mean so much to you?
Well, I think for me, growing up, I didn't really see people who look like me in Australian politics. But one of the things that I've noticed over the past month or so is the impact that it's had on my family. My mum is around the same age as Kamala Harris. They're both part Tamil. My mum went to the same university that Kamala Harris's mum went to. And
practically knows her.
They're just practically Kamala aunties. But seeing the energy and the hope in my parents' faces when we talk about American politics now, it's something that I've never seen before, and it energizes me. It makes me feel like there's something out there that could go quite amazingly in American politics, that somebody like my mum could reach the highest office in the Western world. It's pretty amazing.
Are you interested in politics, Rohan?
Well,
I would like to declare my candidacy, he says. No, but all serious, does it change the dynamic for you?
Absolutely, absolutely, because it shows that it's possible for somebody like me to get into politics. And that's something that I haven't seen in my lifetime. It's not something I expected to see anytime soon. So these kind of big step forwards really mean a lot, I think. Not to speak for everybody, but they mean a lot to me, and I think to people who have similar experiences.
It's funny because while she tells her story, of course, because that's part of her background, she hasn't really been drawing attention to her identity at all. And a lot of commentators are observing that. Have you noticed that? I mean, this is just who she is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've consumed a lot of media about her identity. She did a cooking video with Mindy Kaling in 2020. That was very Indian. But a lot of the coverage about her has definitely been about who she is, where she came from, her identity. But I think in America, there's a stark contrast to Donald Trump. And the fact that she is Asian American, African American, and a woman really contrasts who he is.
George Brandis, has she really changed the race?
Well, the opinion poll evidence seems to suggest that she has. But can I just make I agree with you, by the way. I think role models are very important. But as Anne said a moment ago, it's not just about politics. I mean, role models are important in all careers, in political careers, in the professions, in business, in sport. You know, right across the gamut of people who aspire to achieve great success in their lives. They all need role models, and they need people who look like them, who they can, when they're young, can be their heroes, and they can aspire to be like. So I think you're absolutely right about politics, but it's a much broader question than politics. Now, in relation to Kamala Harris, who can say? I mean, I personally, even though I come from the conservative side of politics, am hoping that Kamala Harris wins because I think Donald Trump is so dreadful. But then I would have voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 because I'm an original believer that Donald Trump is dreadful, not a Johnny-come-lately believer that Donald Trump is dreadful.
So you've been consistent for years?
I've been consistently hostile to Trump for as long as he's been on my radar, yes.
Okay, and how about you, Keith? How are you feeling about Trump?
Well, as members of the Parliament and Anne is in the same position, we respect the decision is the American people's to make, and whoever they elect, as Australian representatives, we would like to work with that administration. But to your point, I was born in Ireland, and I remember many houses would have two pictures above the good room. They had a picture of the Pope and they had a picture of John F. Kennedy. And so for many Irish people, when they saw an Irish background Catholic become the most powerful person in the world, it meant a lot. And I think many people saw that with Rishi Sunak in the United Kingdom, and we saw it with Barack Obama as well. These things do matter. But what I would say is, if you're interested in politics and whatever side or crossbench you're interested in, I'm comforted by, in my party certainly, the diversity of the people who are joining, who are young, from all backgrounds, because there's no barrier to entry, and nor should there be in politics.
It's interesting. Today we published a poll. Now, Australians don't get a vote, but on the ABC News website. And even coalition voters prefer Kamala Harris. Are you surprised by that, George Brandis?
No, I'm not. I mean, I really am not. Kamala Harris is not somebody whose political values would align with mine at all. But I do regard Trump, particularly what Trump's foreign policy would look like, frankly, as a real danger to the West. I mean, he, in my view, would on day one throw Zelensky under a bus. He would send a signal to Putin that Putin can get away with what he liked. And does anybody seriously think that if Putin received that signal, he wouldn't chance his hand somewhere like in the Baltic states? And if that were to happen, does anybody believe that Trump would defend the Baltic states? Of course he wouldn't. And so what happens to NATO? So I'm really alarmed about, in a geopolitical sense, what the election of... I mean, everybody thinks Trump is... I know that thinks Trump is ghastly. That's not the point.
Well, not everyone does, actually.
Well, most of the people I do, and I suspect, Patricia, most of the people you do...
But there are a lot of people, even in our poll
in
Australia, there are a number of people who find him appealing.
Well, I think those people find him appealing because, for all his faults, he is a very savage antagonist of the left. And people who don't like the left, I don't like the left, I'm from a centre-right party, find his critique, his very aggressive critique of a lot of left-wing positions, although a bit vulgar, nevertheless it reaches them. But my point is that there are bigger issues at stake here, which make him too dangerous a person, in my view, to be the President of the United States again.
Roxanne, you said something before that I just love to tease you out on. You said you're energised by Kamala Harris, but she's not the perfect candidate. What are the deficiencies that you're worried about?
It's not that there are deficiencies, it's that there is no such thing as a perfect candidate. And I think that we need to start being real about our political processes and stop expecting politicians who are human to be anything but human. Now, they should be superhuman if they want to lead entire nations, but they are human. And so it's more that I recognize that she's human and that I am not trying to be her friend. Like, a lot of times people seem like they want to befriend politicians, and I'm just like, why? That doesn't seem like...
They're all right.
I mean, these people are fine,
right.
but, you know, in general, like, I don't know that I need to hang out with them, but I do want to know that she won't take the world into World War III. And Donald Trump absolutely will. He's correct. The global implications of a second Trump presidency are alarming, and in the United States, the most vulnerable communities will be irreparably harmed. It's just shocking that he's even allowed to run again, given everything that has happened since January 6th after he lost the election.
Even though Kamala Harris is obviously making it more competitive, like, you know, if you look at the Australian polling, and of course we can't vote, I get all that, but she's really shot up a lot over Joe Biden. But in your country, yes, she's had gains, but it's still so divided.
It's going to be very close, and that's because most people have already known who they were going to vote for. Right now, the country is incredibly polarized, and we're not actually even having policy discussions. It's really just Trump or not Trump. And that was particularly the case when Biden was running. And one of the things that Kamala Harris has brought into the race is that we are starting to have a richer conversation than just Trump or not Trump. It's still, of course, not Trump. But now people feel like there's someone to vote for instead of merely someone to vote against. And so I'm curious to see what happens. I do think Kamala Harris is going to win. And that's wishful
What was
thinking,
that?
but I think Kamala Harris is going to win.
Do you?
I do. I 100% do.
Where do you get that vibe?
Because I cannot tolerate the alternative.
Right. What do you think, George?
Well, for a start, I don't agree with all of that. I certainly don't agree that I think it's a terrible thing to say that Trump shouldn't even be allowed to run. I mean,
He's a convicted felon.
He is the nominee of his party, and a very I mean, you can't even call it with any confidence as to who's likely to win. How can you possibly say that a person who more than 45% of your fellow citizens at the moment would like to see as president shouldn't be allowed to run for office? Now, we talked about, Patricia, we've been talking all night about democracy.
We love it.
We love it. But the thing about democracy is that you have to concede to the other side as much as you would expect them to concede to your point of view. And, I mean, tolerance of people of fundamentally differing views is the essence of democracy.
Yes, but this is not that.
No, with respect, I don't agree. I think that it doesn't matter how... You've heard what I think of Trump, so we're on the same page on that issue. But on the broader issue of ultimately respecting the sovereignty of the people to make a judgment, even though it's a judgment that you wouldn't make, that you might regret or even loathe, is the essence of being committed to democracy.
Would you say that about Hitler?
I wouldn't say that about Hitler.
Because Hitler was elected.
And I think, you know, when you throw sort of Hitler into the argument, you immediately skew it in a peculiar way. I think if we are talking about a functioning democratic system, both in your country and mine, with all its flaws, I think with respect that your system, democracy, has more flaws than the Australian system, but let's park that. You have...
I don't know if Roxanne would really contest that.
You have a person who I think would be a terrible choice, but he's the nominee of his
You're
party.
saying people have the right to make a terrible choice?
Of course they do.
That's the in a
Of course they
nutshell.
do. But we hope they don't.
If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A Live with Anne Ali, Keith Wallahan, Roxanne Gay and George Brandis. Let's keep the conversation going tonight with a question from Andrew Tran. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, PK. Hi, panel. With the right to disconnect laws that start today, does it reveal a deeper crisis in workplace cultures? I mean, if we need a law to enforce personal boundaries, are we failing to balance productivity and employee well-being? And do we need a radical rethink of this idea of kind of work-life balance?
That's for you.
I think with a lot of these well-meaning ideas, and people having a work-life balance is a well-meaning idea that we all share, all reasonable people cherish. But it's about who defines and who decides. So that has come in today for businesses that have 15 or more employees. And it's also come in at a time when there's changes to the definitions of casual employment, at a time when we have had 5 quarters of per capita drop in growth. That's a GDP per capita recession. And one of the key areas to lift productivity is in our labour laws. And key to that is allowing people to treat each other as adults. So at the moment, there are many businesses that are confused as to how this will work. They're confused as to what the guidelines are. And in the end, the definition of reasonable, it's one of the most litigated words in the courts, because when you push that out of the employer-employee relationship and into the courts, you're bringing uncertainty into a key part of the economy. So I am worried about what that means for productivity when we need it to improve more than ever.
Anne Ali.
Couple of things. So first of all, I don't think that a work-life balance is a nice idea. I actually think it's a right, and it's a worker's right to have a work-life balance. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I take your point about, reasonable and what that means, but in the same breath, you're saying that, adults should be able to negotiate. This is very simple. It's basically, if you are paid to work 8 hours a day and you decide not to answer the phone or send the email while you're bathing the kids or you're at family dinner or you're out on date night, right, you shouldn't be punished for that. You should not be punished for that. You shouldn't face losing your job for that. You should be able to say to your boss, I've worked my 8 hours, I need to have a work-life balance. That is simply it. And you know what? If that was happening, we wouldn't need the laws.
Andrew, what do you think of the laws? What do you think of the laws?
On one hand, I think it's actually really important that employees now have a right to be able to refuse contact. But on the other hand, there's a question for me as to why we even need a law in the first place. We're talking about a breakdown in trust and respect for employees, and we're talking about workplaces not actually just having meaningful conversations with the people that they rely on to function as to how do you work in a way that enables you to thrive? At what times of the days are you able to kind of balance your work and life? And how do we actually support you to do that? If we kind of focus on employee well-being, it's actually good for business, but we're losing sight of the humanness and the equality as part of this.
Okay. Next, we'll hear from Annette Gorey. Annette.
The world is filled with cries and demands to free Palestine, but with Iran the key player in the region and supplying arms to Hamas and its many proxies, and seemingly directing the multi-pronged attacks on Israel, if the goal of eliminating Israel is achieved, will Palestine really be free, or will it just be another Iranian outpost? And where to next for Iran?
Anne?
Well, it's no secret that I am supportive of the aspiration of Palestinian people for their self-determination and a two-state solution. The Palestinian people to live securely within their borders and Israeli people to live securely within their borders of Israel. I do not abide by any of these ideas that sometimes are put to me about the eradication of one or the other. A two-state solution is the only way forward to a long-lasting peace. What it takes to get to that two-state solution, I think first and foremost, I am focused on, as is our government, on a ceasefire. A ceasefire, a return of the hostages and end to the hostilities, and a pathway towards a long-standing peace. For Palestinian recognition to occur, for Palestinian statehood to occur. It's not just a matter of recognition, and there's a little bit of, there are different points of view on this. Some say that if every country in the world recognises Palestine, then it's recognised by proxy. But then there is the other argument about the Montevideo protocols and meeting the 4 requirements of those protocols, one of them being a distinct governing body, having a governing body. At the moment, you've got in the West Bank, you've got the Palestinian Authority, and in Gaza, you've got Hamas. And so that is the major hurdle to achieving Palestinian statehood, to my mind. You know, I think it's a really worrying situation. I am deeply, deeply concerned about further escalation of violence in the region. And, you know, I think in a way the world has kind of become accustomed to the Middle East being this, you know, place that's going to ignite any minute now. But this is really, I think, it's a real crisis point at the moment. And I think we all must lend our voices, and we all must do everything we can for a ceasefire and a de-escalation.
The question, though, the idea that Gaza would become a sort of Iranian outpost.
I don't know that that's a possibility, to be honest. I think the best that we can do in that regard is to assist in ensuring that the Palestinian Authority, or whatever governing body there is, and I've read different articles on this and different suggestions on you know, interim governing bodies, etc. But, you know, if Australia can help to strengthen the governance in Palestine, I think we can prevent that from happening. Not that I don't really see it happening, but I think we can prevent that from happening. I also think it's a really important thing that we do, is to ensure that Palestine has a governance framework.
George Brandes?
So I think that we should always bear in mind, as Anne has just said, that part of the complexity of this very, very difficult problem are complications within Palestinian politics themselves, the hatred between Fatah and Hamas historically, and the difficulty, therefore, of constructing a governance framework from that in those circumstances. But I also think that when we address this issue, there is one thing above all that we should bear in mind, and that is Israel is the only functioning democracy in the Middle East. Israel is a friend of Australia. We cooperate with them in a range of ways that are very important to our national interest, as I well remember when I was the Attorney General, the level of intelligence cooperation which we enjoyed with the Israelis, which saved Australian lives, by the way. Hamas, which Australia declares to be a terrorist organisation and which is committed to the genocide of the people of Israel, is not to be placed on the same any basis of moral equivalence with Israel. There is no moral equivalence here between a friendly democracy and a terrorist organisation, Hamas, whose very charter commits it to genocide as defined in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention.
A good, interesting point. But, I mean, you call it a friendly democracy. If you're a person in Gaza, I don't think you'd see it as a friendly democracy.
I'm talking from an Australian perspective,
I know, but
Patricia.
for people in Gaza, you can understand that that's not their relationship.
And of course you can. I'm sorry to interrupt. And I think also we should not confuse Hamas and the Palestinian people in Gaza. I mean, the Palestinian people in Gaza are not the same as Hamas.
Well, that's an interesting point, because as you know, and Keith Wallahan, you know, there has been a big discussion in our parliament about and the conflation of those two. Does that worry you?
Well, I think anything worries me that confuses a debate about a difficult issue. But I mean,
but I mean the conflation of you're a Gazan being seen as sympathetic to Hamas just because you're a Gazan.
Well, if you're a Gazan, you are going to be sympathetic. You're a Palestinian, so you're going to be sympathetic to the Palestinian position. And of course, Israel's activities to try and eliminate Hamas and the Hamas terrorist network, which is housed in Gaza, is going to affect you. So, of course, you're going to respond in that way. But the point I'm trying to make is we should not assume that Gaza and the people of Gaza and Hamas are the same thing, because they're not.
No. Keith, there has been a debate in the Parliament, though, about that. I do feel for some of the Gazans who probably hate Hamas but can't say it, right? Do you feel for those people? I mean, a lot of them have come to Australia.
Oh, of course I do.
I've spoken to one of them. It says, I have no sympathy for Hamas.
You wouldn't be human if you didn't have that sympathy for them in that predicament. But to the substance of the question about Iran, I think it's important to address that. There isn't a conflict of consequence in that region that doesn't have the IRGC's fingerprints on it. And, of course, we have Hamas listed as a terrorist organisation, but I think it's important that we look at the IRGC being listed as a terrorist organisation, not just because of the instability in the region, but because of how they treat their own people. And we saw that in the Women Life Freedom movement and the protests that occurred here. It's a destabilising force. And I think when we step up and zoom out of this conflict, we need to turn our attention to the role of Iran in not just destabilising that region, but the entire world.
I've got to bring you in, Roxanne. I know you've been hoping for a different position perhaps from the new candidate for the Democrats on Gaza, but I know you've also been criticised, I've seen it online myself, for saying that Israel has a right to defend itself. So it's a very polarised environment.
Yes, and the person that said that didn't say the rest of my sentence, which is that I believe in a free Palestine, which I 100% do. I think that we should have a two-state solution. You cannot get rid of an entire people, whether they are Israeli or Palestinian. And I don't think we should conflate Israelis with their government, just as we should not conflate Palestinians with Hamas. And there are, of course, clearly political answers to this question, but I also think about the human answer to this question, which is that tens of thousands of people have died and they keep being shuffled into smaller and smaller parcels of land. And it's primarily children who are suffering. There are people who are going hungry. And yes, we need to figure out the political solution. And no one has been able to do this for 100 years. So it's clearly a difficult problem. And Iran is the instigator of all of this. And we have to put that responsibility where it belongs. But as the rest of the world, surely we can say that you must have a ceasefire now. We must get those hostages back, and we should stop arming the people who are dropping these bombs on innocent people every single day.
Now we have a question from Denise Lofts.
As you know, Michelle Obama's speech highlighted the sense of hope, hard work for the common good. Also a hope that not just a victory, but of vanquishing the demons of fear, division and hate that have consumed us. Have Australians lost their sense of hope in politics, therefore hope in democracy, particularly in our young people?
Anne Ali.
I don't think so. I think every time I go out and talk to young people and the young people that we engage through the Office for Youth, through my portfolio of youth, I'm enthused. I think, Australia, the future is bright for Australia with the young people that we have. I think about Linda Burney she gave her valedictory speech in Parliament just last week, and she spoke about, continuing to hold hope. And she spoke about, it was such an inspiring speech, and I encourage you all to look at it. And it really brought me back to the absolute privilege that we have and the reason why I show up every day for the people that I represent. I think there are, 27 million reasons to have hope in this country and in its future.
Keith?
I absolutely agree. This is my first term of Parliament. We never know, it might be my only term. That's up to the people of Menzies. But before we went to air, Anne Ali said, "Good luck, Keith." And I said, "You too." And there's a lot of that in politics that people don't see. I'm doing a course at the moment that's run by the McKinnon Institute, and the head of that is Rod Glover, who's married to Peter Murphy. Peter Murphy sadly passed away, but she influenced my life and how I view myself as a parliamentarian. And Rod said something recently that stuck with me. He said, your task is to build a reservoir of trust in an infinite game. And it stuck with me because in an infinite game, we will come and go, but the Parliament will be there, Australia will be there, and we need to go to sleep every night saying that I did my best that day, that week, and left the place a bit better than I found it. And I think the way you do that is that you put principle over power wherever you can. And that usually clashes with self-interest. And if you put the people before you, I think you're on the right track. So I hope I live up to Rod and Peter's advice in that regard.
Well, let's talk. Well, one of the things that they want is a full ban on gambling advertising. Is that something you still believe?
It is. I signed the Murphy report, and I did that proudly. But in politics, you've got to bring people with you. And so I'm a proud member of my party, and you've got to bring people with you. And
you're trying to bring them with you still because they're not for a full ban.
Oh, we'll wait and see. So at the moment, it's for the government to produce a bill, and we'll scrutinise that. But I do respect my colleagues and their different views on that.
Okay. And when you said Peter Murphy had a huge influence on you, how so?
She was a courageous leader, and I was on 2 committees with her, one where we agreed on gambling reform and another where we didn't on The Voice. And what I noted in that, we had different views, but we fundamentally respected each other's position, and we would have fierce debates, but then we would go and enjoy each other's company afterwards. And again, I think the more we do that in politics, the better we'll be as a nation.
Okay, our next question comes from Tim Bennett. Hi, Tim.
Is there an increasing threat to democracy from foreign hackers? And if so, how can we defend against them?
You're talking about foreign interference in our political system.
Elections.
George Brandis, is that a huge problem?
It is, and you know, when I was the attorney, I was asked by the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull to develop the laws which we then passed to deal with foreign interference. It was a gap in our law that there was conduct which didn't meet the threshold of espionage, but which was nevertheless invidious and detrimental to Australia's democracy, that was being completely missed by the legal system. So we passed the foreign interference laws, and they have worked. I mean, ASIO, which is in charge of their enforcement, has reported that they have noticed a significant change in the behaviour of malign foreign actors. Now, that's not to say, by the way, that it doesn't continue to occur, but it's occurring a lot less than it was, and where it does occur, it is now sanctioned. So you're right in identifying the problem. This is the way the former coalition government, with bipartisan support, I hasten to add, dealt with the problem. It's a work in progress because these were world-leading laws that we developed, and I think the current Attorney General has them under review and for further refinement, which is what you do with a new suite of laws.
Just briefly, but because we're running out of time, but do you see our next election, I mean, it's happening in the US, as being potentially interfered with in this way?
I don't think it's just foreign actors that we need to worry about in terms of undermining democracy. There's a whole lot of misinformation, disinformation. There's a lot out there about AI as well that's out there as well. I think we need a really holistic lens on that. And I think, you know, democracy by its nature is tension, right? But we need to remain ever vigilant to ensuring that the institutions that we have are resilient enough to withhold that tension.
Keith?
I agree, and it gives me comfort that the Australian Electoral Commission, A, is there, B, is independent, and C, is looking at this. That they don't take that for granted, and certainly it's a task force that they have at the moment, and they should treat it seriously, because through our technology apps, you can have anyone reach in and try and influence an election, and we must all work together to prevent that.
Our last question tonight comes from Rosemary King. Where is lucky last Rosemary? Hi, Rosemary.
Hi. Hi, Roxanne. A question for you. Has there been a moment in pop culture in the last decade that has made you either lose or regain your faith in humanity?
Oh, yes. You know, I hope I never lose my faith in humanity, because then I wouldn't really find the motivation to do the work that I do. But even I don't have to go a decade back. I was really warmed by Gus Waltz, the son of Tim Waltz, the vice presidential candidate in the U.S., and the way he was so open with his emotion, with his pride for his father, and like shouting, "That's my dad." That's a well-parented child. That's all you know. Like when you can see someone who's been that well-parented, and more importantly, that well-loved, that just really reaffirmed my faith in humanity. And every time I see that clip, I am moved to tears.
Yeah, that was definitely a collective cry moment every time. Thank you very much. And thank you to our audience, our panel. That's all we have time for tonight. Keith Wallahan, Anne Ali, Roxanne Gay, who's also here for the Festival of Dangerous Ideas and will be speaking at the Wheeler Centre in Melbourne tomorrow night, George Brandis, and earlier, David Runciman. And thank you for sharing your stories and your questions. Next week, I'll be with you live from Dandenong in Melbourne. You can head to our website to register to be in the audience. It's been a really fascinating conversation tonight. It's not just about democracy sausages, it's also about being part of the system. And thank you for watching. Have a terrific night. Good night.